Thorin could be considered one of the most divisive figures in esports, or rather, even sometimes largely in gaming when he starts to get a ton of publicity. And I think the villain of esports is quite a very apt name, but largely I think his character is quite misunderstood because a lot of people usually only catch anecdotes via his tweets or, small snippets of videos or clips, and they actually don't understand the full context of him, or rather his own history. Now, for those that don't know, Duncan Thorin Shields is prescribed as the esports historian as his nickname, although a lot of people think that he's prescribed that himself, but he was actually given that from someone else in the early 2000s. He has over 1,200 Thorin Thoughts videos, 400 reflections, interviews with prominent players historically, and the longest running League of Legends esports podcast. He first started doing paid esports journalism in 2001 and largely got his very first big break in SK Gaming back in 2009 and worked at On Gamers in 2013 as his other big break. He's published in several different places such as Izento, Gold Per 10, and Esports Heaven. He is the recipient of the Esports Journalist of the Year Award in 2017 and Esports Journalist of the Year Award for 2012 and 2013 by Cadred, aka Esports Heaven. He is also an accomplished broadcast talent as well. Most people know him for his videos or his YouTube or even his Twitter. And he's actually been on several different esports broadcasts in a multitude of CSGO analyst desks. And he's appeared in 8 CSGO majors. I think actually he's the record holder for the most appearances on an analyst desk. I'm not sure if that's the case now, but the impressive thing about Thorin, and I think kind of one of the ways that he's really underrated in some aspects as far as his content, is that he's created content through a breadth of different games. He's covered Quake, Unreal Tournament, Counter-Strike 1.6, Counter-Strike Source, Counter-Strike Go, and then of course CS2. He's done StarCraft, Brood War, Dota 2, League of Legends, Overwatch, Valorant. I mean, this guy has covered a lot of different esports, and I'm not sure actually how he's able to do that. He's done multiple different podcasts too as well in different genres, such as his Oversight podcast in Overwatch, when, that was kind of a fucking game. Valorant with his Daring Minds podcast, obviously League of Legends with his Summoning Insight. And he's done various different podcasts in League of Legends as well, too, as offshoots. And, there's one, I guess, big quote that I think that would summarize maybe the kind of philosophy, I guess, and how he's able to branch out into multiple different games and whatnot, which is a famous Miyamoto Musashi quote from the Book of Five Rings, which says, "Once you know the way broadly, you will see it in all things." And I think that kind of sums up what Thorin is, or I guess his approach to his entire work, which is the fact that, since he's learned, from Quake and Counter-Strike so heavily in terms of studying the game and obviously interviewing various different people from that scene, he's then able to transfer that knowledge over into multiple different other scenes, such as what we've seen with League of Legends or with Valorant or with Overwatch even. And I think a lot of people can kind of learn from that and figure out, okay, how do you use some of your skills that you've learned in other different areas and are able to then kind of apply that to a different genre or a different game. And one of the craziest things about his entire career is that he actually started with doing video content very late, in fact. He was mostly just a writer and mostly just kind of a news reporter, right? He would put in, I guess you call it a put in like stats or score lines for different various games of like, the results of a game, because back in the day in early websites, there was no easy way to track who actually won a match. I had been watching Counter-Strike 1.6 since about 2005, 2006 era-ish. And really, there was no easy way to keep up with the game itself. You kind of had to be on multiple different forums in order to figure out exactly who won a particular match or whatnot. Or you would have to catch, some of the highlights or frag videos in order to figure out who actually won, that particular CEVO or, CPL event even. So there was no easy way to do that. And that was one of his early jobs, in fact. So he had been largely just writing only in particular before he even got to what made him more famous, I guess, in the esports industry, which is through his YouTube and then, of course, later on through his Twitter. And so he went and transferred, I guess, a lot of his different skills from writing over into the, video space. And I think that's kind of inspiration, I guess, for the series that I've created here, Izento's Inclination, and the fact that I actually used to write in the very beginning before I even did any YouTube videos at all, or, before I even knew how to, I guess, speak somewhat eloquently, I guess, in front of a camera, or even do interviews. I had first started doing text interviews and written interviews before I was then able to go onto camera and then do those videos itself. So I think that him doing both of these different mediums has revealed that there's kind of a flexibility in which mediums unlock even more creative potential. You can see that sometimes he'll do a written piece, or sometimes he'll do, a video, and it unlocks a different potential or different creative that you can do. And I've kind of taken that into my own philosophy of creating different videos or just doing different written works. I can do either a writing, of a famous player or something, or what I think about a particular player, a particular series that's coming up. I can do an interview, right? That's a different medium, a creative medium that I can use at my disposal, in order to get more insights into the scene. You can do videos, even video versus a written format. Those are two different completely types of different mediums that you can use at your disposal. One, writing is usually more clear and you can be more concise. Videos are kind of more off the cuff and you don't really have to get into the nitty gritty of exactly the points that you're trying to make. I'm, doing documentaries, and that's a particularly different angle that I can now approach as far as like a creative medium. And then of course doing video editing or investigative work. Those are all different types of mediums that are now at my disposal. And one of that approach was kind of taken from Thorin and his different approach of doing a writing piece or a video piece of just the Thorin's thoughts videos. It's a really great way to separate exactly how you want to approach a particular idea, and then maybe you can flesh it out even better because you're able to actually have all these different mediums at your disposal, which then allows you, of course, to create more work. You always have a medium to go to and able to like kind of flesh that idea out, versus some other people would actually have that idea die out because they don't actually have the tools at their disposal in order to execute that piece, so to speak. Now, one area that I think a lot of people have a problem with Thorin is that essentially he's a very abrasive figure, right, to say the least. But I think that in itself is because he's never really shied away from having a unpopular opinion. And in this kind of day and age, it's very weird because a lot of people will try and go for the consensus idea and then kind of propagate that into, I guess, the internet, because of course the internet is a place where no one ever forgets what you've ever said, right? People will always draw up old shit and old beef from, way back in the day, and they will hold that against you forever and throughout all time. And one thing that I think is largely misunderstood about Thorin himself is that people think that he's a contrarian or that he uses clickbait. I guess all journalists kind of use clickbait to some degree, but it's not what people think that it is. Clickbait, essentially, in the definition of it, is clicking on something and not getting the product that you were promised, right? But clicking on an enticing title is not clickbait. That's just a good fucking title. So that's just one side note and gripe that I have with people that use the term incorrectly and just don't know vocabulary itself. But himself and being a contrarian, I actually don't think that's the case, because he just simply has an unpopular opinion that he's willing to express that no one else is willing to express because they think they'll get crucified on the internet. And in some cases they will, yes, but in other cases people are just afraid to say that because obviously I said, the internet never forgets. You think of the instances that he's gone against TSM. Did you know that a lot of people in the industry, especially journalists, never liked TSM, in fact? They actually hated the organization because of the shady tactics that they would use against journalists. They would sometimes, put out things before journalists would release a article or something, even though they notified, TSM like, hey, we're going to release this. Do you have anything that you would want to say as a courtesy for 24 hours before we release this? And then they would just release the fucking, the news themselves. Obviously, of course, TSM has been notorious for not doing interviews or things like that with smaller different outlets, and they would only do things with like ESPN or big outlets like Invent Global back in the day. And this is, of course, the League of Legends side that I'm talking about things. T1, he's obviously been outspoken in some instances of, things like Faker when he's not performing and whatnot. And Faker is obviously the GOAT of League of Legends, but no one would ever say anything bad about Faker, right? And obviously with T1 fans and Korean culture in particular, which has been borrowed from, I guess, the K-pop culture, is they are incredibly fanatic about their heroes, I guess, in that society, or, people that they propagate up to the entire hierarchy. So to go against Faker is basically blasphemy of, saying to a god that, you don't believe in that religion. So he's one of the outspoken figures towards Faker or towards T1 itself. You can even go and transpose that to Simple, right? He's been outspoken in some instances against Simple and Counter-Strike Go. And people are always afraid to challenge the GOAT and criticize, whatever plays that he makes, or if he's not playing to the degree that he should be able to be playing in a particular tournament or setting. Then, of course, you have Fnatic, which is one of the biggest orgs in Europe, being outspoken against them in some instances, especially within the League of Legends space. You have ESL, one of the biggest tournament organizers in Counter-Strike history, in fact, and the willingness of him going to war against ESL in some situations. You have his instance of basically being at heads with Riot Games and their pay or their treatment of casters themselves. Back in history, you have his defense against G2 Carlos, where the entire esports community went against Carlos or Ocelot for hanging out with Andrew Tate. You have even something that I think was obscure and people didn't really catch on at the time, which was Saint Vicious, where he talked about not believing in depression. And then, of course, Thorin reached out immediately to the guy and he said, hey, do you want to do an interview? You can explain yourself and explain your whole thought process. He reached out and extended to that guy, over in the League of Legends space. You had Danny from Evil Geniuses and talking about the atrocities of Evil Geniuses and how they mistreated a player and his mental health episodes, and then you had player salaries and him coming out in the League of Legends space and talking about how essentially players have been greedy this entire time within League of Legends, and that they're basically taking bread off the table that doesn't necessarily belong to them, and that organizations are hurting way more than people realize. And then of course you have this recent development with Saudi Arabia spending tons of money in esports, and how he's refused to accept Saudi money, and calling out hypocrisies within the industry about other people taking Saudi money that goes directly against their morals of LGBTQ ethics and shit like that. So he's clearly had a lot of different instances to where he will express an unpopular opinion. And I think obviously, that's probably why he gets so much hate from the entire industry. But also notice how it's mostly plebs, or it's mostly mainstream games journalists, like just games journalists, right? Gaming industry, not necessarily even esports industry that necessarily hates him that much. It's more so people from the outside that end up chiming in whenever there's a big controversy, or, you know, he's talking about like gaming, feminism, in esports and whatnot. It's always people from the outside that suddenly come in and have an opinion about him. And I think it's his ability to be able to generate controversy or generate things like that come from his ideas about just having an unpopular opinion, or something that people don't want to say oftentimes. So when you go just from his Twitter personality, I guess, or even on his videos, another underrated aspect of just his entire body of work itself is his analyst desk. And it's the fact that he's able to express a unpopular opinion on the analyst desk. He's able to flame players, or flame organizations, or even flame the fucking tournament organizers themselves while on the analyst desk. And that's something that has spiced up, I guess, the broadcast when it comes to Counter-Strike Go, that no other analyst has seemingly been able to do. And he brings that particular element that no other analyst has done. Most of the analysts that go onto, you know, the Counter-Strike desks are talking about strategies, or they're talking about, you know, particular ways in which players are playing right now, or their particular form, or what this means for the future for a particular player, or bringing up the past of a player. Like, Thorin is able to bring up a narrative of a player, and, you know, obviously the historical references of a player themselves, just because of, you know, his uncanny memory, as it were. But most analysts are not able to actually flame a player on the desk. And if you're a League of Legends, I guess, fan, and you don't watch any of Counter-Strike, and you just only know Thorin from the League of Legends side of things, you're entirely missing out on some great analyst desk work, and something that you would never fucking see on the League of Legends broadcast, like in a million years. And it's kind of crazy because the Counter-Strike desks are actually more willing to criticize players and criticize teams, versus in League of Legends, you notice that it's always praising the team that won necessarily, rather than berating the team that lost most of the time. And so for him to be spicy in Counter-Strike Go is like unheard of. Then if you were to then transport Thorin's personality and his takes over into League of Legends, that's something that just wouldn't even exist in that type of, there's nothing close to that, in fact. And I think a lot of people that are that haven't actually watched a Counter-Strike tournament, or, you know, a broadcast with Thorin on there, are just totally missing out on that. And I think a lot of analysts wish they could say what he says. And I think this is because one huge aspect, you know, aside from his whole morals and just willingness to always tell the truth no matter what, even if it may hurt him in the end, is that he's been able to create a independence, right? He has his own YouTube channel. He has his own Substack now. He's always been able to get writings, in different outlets and different esports media organizations. And it's because he's been able to cultivate a essence of like, oh, fuck you money. And when you look at a whole bunch of different journalists within, the esports landscape, most of them have not been able to get to the fuck you money point or the fuck you independence point even, which is more important than the actual money itself. And he's been able to build up his own brand and be able to do that. But many people, I think, would be mistaken in assuming that Thorin has always been like this big character and he's always been able to get tons of money and whatnot. Because if you don't know the backstory of Thorin, and at least from what I've gathered from watching him throughout the years and multiple different videos, is that he actually comes from a poor background. He comes from the north of England, which as you go further and further north, of course, because obviously it's going to be colder, that means that it's going to be less ideal real estate up there and poorer communities and things like that. And so he comes from a poorer background and he's never really had, I guess, the structure or the financial structure in order to pursue esports properly like a lot of other people would. And I can actually relate to that a lot. Like I'll just say, like, my father had to drink from a different water fountain than certain other people back in the day. So I can kind of fuck with that mentality or that upbringing of coming from a poor area and now having to try and make something of yourself in a new area and kind of find a different passion, and being able to do that rather than being forced to work and grind through shit that you don't really want to do and be stuck in the same slum that, your family or your upbringing has always known. And I think that drives a certain kind of a manifestation of drive, right? That just some people don't have, like PC, like personal computer esports, just comes from a different, I guess, upbringing or background usually, because obviously, of course, PCs are very expensive, especially back in the day. PCs were very expensive. And then the internet back in the day was very expensive as well, that a lot of people, you don't have if you don't have a lot of money in order to get those particular things. And so you have people in esports themselves that usually come from a very good or, at least average upbringing. So there are different, I guess, scales of bad that you could consider, when it comes to, I guess, the manifestation of drive and where that drive comes from. And it's the fact that there are different scales of bad, right? There's only the worst thing that you've ever experienced is the worst thing that you've ever experienced, right? So whether that be getting denied from the College of Columbia or Cornell or UCLA or some shit, right? Like that's the worst thing that could happen to a particular group of people, versus the worst thing for another group of people might be not being able to eat or getting evicted from your house, right? Like there are scales to this shit. So I think it's weird that people have a different, I guess, catch-all approach when it comes to encompassing all the different personalities within esports and reflecting on them and pushing on, I guess, their morals or their ethics onto different people and creating a blanket of what they expect of a particular person within esports. Because you have to remember that everybody in esports, like the great thing about esports is that everyone comes from different parts of the world, right? It's not limited by location, kind of theoretically, right? I guess our servers or whatnot limit that, but theoretically you can get into esports at any part of the world, granted that you have an internet connection and you have a computer, right? Or even a console, right? So you can get into esports no matter what. It's the great equalizer, I guess, of sports itself. But people forget that with that, you have people from different cultures and I guess different inclinations. So you're not going to have everyone being on the same page as far as their morals or ethics, right? Like I come from the United States. We have different ethics than people from England, especially people from the north of England. So to expect them to have your same philosophy or your same inclinations, or you to agree 100% with what that person says in particular, is just unrealistic. And for some reason in the modern internet age, we've come to believe that someone should hold the same values or the same ethics of you, at least if they speak the same fucking language as you, right? Or, English. And some people even forget that sometimes, with some of these different esports players and whatnot, this English is like their second or third language. Why would you expect them to hold the same morals or ethics as you? That's the stupidest reasoning ever. So to hold, someone like Thorin, someone who grew up in a poor neighborhood, a poor background, socioeconomic status, and not only that, but he comes from England itself, right, which is a completely different culture, and then to push on it, and it's usually the US people that are pushing on a type of morals or ethics onto everybody else in every other different nation. It's just a stupid ask, right? It's dumb to expect someone to adopt all of your different idiosyncrasies and then expect them to kind of come into esports and expect the same behavior. I just think that's complete bullshit. And one of the big particular reasons as to why I think Thorin is very misunderstood within the entire esports community. Now, as far as his work ethic, this guy's work ethic is just fucking insane. So for his Thorin's thoughts, I believe back in the day, I want to say a couple years ago, this was like 2019 or something, he did a Thorin's thought streaks of, I think it was 100 videos over 100 days. So on average, he did one video per day. That's insane. I don't think people understand how difficult it is, even just creatively, to come up with something like that. Is just absolutely absurd. So for instance, for my shit, from 2017 to 2019, I did 100 pieces of content each year, right? So for 3 years straight, I did 100 pieces of content. So that averages out to obviously one piece of content every 3 days, which is, pretty good in its own right. And given that, I work a full-time job and whatnot, that's actually pretty decent, I would say, but that's not 100 videos in 100 days. That's something that I'm not even sure if I could match on my best year if I could ever do that. And one of the cool things that he's kind of instilled within that is that you're essentially lying to yourself for not being able to do the work that you set out to try and do, right? Because my goal, back then was to do 100 pieces every year. And if I would fall short of that goal, you don't really have any excuse for that. You set out a goal, you set expectations, that's what you should try and shoot for. And if you fall short of that, really, you can't blame anyone but yourself, right? There's no external factors that should limit you from being able to do that work, right? It's 100 pieces in 365 days. You should be able to do that, right? You have a couple days to even fuck up. You should be able to at least do that, right? And if you aren't able to do that, then you're just lying to yourself. And so I think he's able to push this kind of workhorse mentality that a lot of people in esports just don't do. And I think esports in general is actually quite a lazy industry, right? We're all fucking gamers. We want to stay inside and we want to play video games, even to the detriment of working inside a cool industry that allows you to play video games almost on the daily. People are so lazy that they can't even work in order to exist in an industry that allows them to do that, which is just, some of the most absurd shit. Now, as far as the people that he's helped and why I think the moniker of the villain of esports is kind of a misnomer, is that he's actually helped a ton of different people behind the scenes. And a lot of people forget this, or a lot of people just don't know in general, because it goes across genres, right? And that's, I guess, one of the detriments that doesn't really necessarily help his career, because esports is quite siloed. So you don't actually hear of all the different stories itself. So we're going to go on some of the people that he's actually helped, and I'll show you. So one of the big people that he's helped is Kelsey Moser in League of Legends, who is a prominent analyst within the scene. She was also a journalist for a time, worked for multiple different esports media outlets, such as something like Yahoo Esports or ESPN. And then she's gone on to work for esports organizations like 100 Thieves or Evil Geniuses and whatnot. He first had helped her with his show called Narrative Wake. It was a podcast that was for League of Legends, and he noticed, okay, this person isn't that spicy, and so they could use a little bit of personality injection in there, and being able to actually publicly speak. And so he gave her a platform and actually did a podcast with her, and it was quite successful. It got a lot of numbers. It was one of the great podcasts of League of Legends itself. You have Emily Rand, another person who he had put onto a podcast as well, someone who was quite dry in the very beginning, was another writer within the League of Legends space that worked for, big companies like Yahoo Esports, ESPN, the likes of that. And he noticed that she had a very analytical mind for the game. So he did another podcast so that she could show, her own personality. Now, of course, she works on the Riot broadcast for the LCS. And, obviously now she's over at MSI and doing big tournaments like that. You have even someone smaller than that. Ashley Kang is another person over in the LCK of League of Legends. He's helped that journalist, being able to bring her on different talk shows and things like that. I think even at one point he made a bet with her that, if she couldn't do something or this particular team wouldn't win or whatnot, and he would pay a trip to some international tournament. I think it was MSI. And he followed through with that bet, in fact. So he bought tickets for that person to go to an international tournament. So he's kind of helped that budding career. Over in Valorant, Geo, who I actually think technically probably comes from Counter-Strike, he's done a podcast with her called Daring Minds, where they talk about Valorant and everything that's going on within that scene. And even funnily enough, that's been a game to where Thorin has often criticized and said, well, it's basically just a watered down fucking version of Counter-Strike. Like, why would I like that piece of shit game? But, he seems to find some appeal towards that particular genre, and he's been able to do a podcast with someone that's not as well known with Geo. You have Veteran, another person way back if you go in League of Legends, where he did another podcast called Elitist United, where they talked about the European side of League of Legends, and he was able to kind of bring that person up to prominence because, of course, they were a journalist in the background, and they were an analyst that mostly gave their thoughts on Twitter or whatnot. So he gave them another platform. You have someone like Maui Snake. Maui Snake, people know from the Counter-Strike scene, and that he is oftentimes now on Counter-Strike analyst desks, and he's been able to give spicy takes and whatnot. He used to actually be Thorin's research assistant. If you go on Thorin's YouTube channel, you'll see that there's a playlist of Thorin's assistant research work, and it's all videos from Maui Snake. So he used to help out Thorin doing, gathering different data points or research points for Thorin to then use in whatever later pieces that he created, whether that be written or video content. So he's clearly not afraid to help people. He's been a big propagator of small people within just the entire esports landscape, not just let alone League of Legends, but, in Counter-Strike or in Valorant or even in Overwatch. So he's not afraid to kind of share the wealth, as it were, or to even give away some of the secret sauce. I find that in some of his videos, he'll even talk about how to just do interviews themselves, of how to be a better interviewer. And he'll give away some of his tips or whatnot about how to do interviews, and be proficient at that. So the whole reason and why I created this video entirely was because I realized that I've never created a video about Thorin, which is strange enough because clearly I've taken a lot of his different philosophies about how to create content and applied it to my own. But recently he opened a Substack, which is a place where you can find all of his work. He's gone from the days of, being writing for different websites and things like that. And now he has his own website where he's creating a lot of his own written work as something that he had put on the back burner for quite a couple years now. And because he's mostly been able to do podcasts or, video work and whatnot. So he's opened up a Substack, and I thought this was a good way to kind of go and do a reflection of history of who Thorin was and what he is currently today in terms of the esports landscape. And I think he's become the esports villain itself, but everyone, I think, is afraid to say that they like Thorin and that, they enjoy his content, because I've been, in press rooms and whatnot, or talking with other esports prominent people, and they often say that, yeah, I was watching the recent Thorin video or whatnot, and they'll say it in a hushed tone or something. And really, in particular, I think he's your favorite player or your favorite personality's favorite content creator. And a lot of people don't know. You would think fans, would think that, no one is watching Thorin besides other fans or whatnot. But actually, a lot of different content creators or personalities within the esports scene or other journalists even watch Thorin's content. And they're actually secret fans of his, but they just say it in hushed tones, right? Because they don't agree with 100% of everything of what he says, because we're in this fucked up landscape on the internet to where you have to 100% agree with everything that someone says, or else then you can't say that you like that particular person. And I think it's fine for fans to hate him. That's completely fine if you hate him for his Twitter or maybe something that he said against your team, or you hate some of his videos or whatnot. I think that's actually fine, because they hate Thorin as the persona. But the esports industry should pay a little bit of homage to who he is as a colleague, or for how much he's helped particular individuals even, because it's very rare for someone to be able to continue doing work without any kind of praise, even more so without praise from industry insiders publicly. So here's to Thorin for providing insightful thoughts. And if you're new to the esports space, you would do very well to pay very careful attention to the actions of Thorin, because you might learn a thing or two.